A lot of times we argue against, we're arguing against 16th century Catholicism, or what they think is 16th century Catholicism. That doesn't exist anymore.
Welcome back to the show, everybody. My name is Javier Perdomo, and this place is a YouTube channel where I like to, do theology videos, church history videos, do apologetics, and mainly, especially lately, doing apologetics, dealing with Roman Catholicism, and hopefully, Lord willing, in the future, Eastern Orthodoxy as well. As you all know, if it's not your first time here with the channel, or if it's your first time here, I guess this will be your first time hearing it. I care a lot about being able to share the stories of people that have dealt with the claims of Eastern Orthodoxy or Roman Catholicism and have come out the other side Protestant. I feel like our Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox counterparts on YouTube do a really good job of displaying the journeys of converts or displaying the journeys of people that are now even more staunchly Roman Catholic or more staunchly Eastern Orthodox. And so I think that's something that we need to do a better job with on our side. And that's what I like to do. And so there's a lot of those videos on my channel. There's a lot that are coming up as well. And so today with us, we have my new friend, Jeff from aGoyforJesus. How are you doing, Jeff?
Nice to meet you.
So as I mentioned before, we're going to have you here in a minute, share your story, and then we ask you some questions. This interview will probably be a little bit different, given that you have your own YouTube channel, as everyone can see on the screen.
It hasn't really been active for a little bit, been too busy. It was more active during COVID and such.
Yeah, fair enough. But there's a lot of great content on there. I'll tell you, I have a massive Roman Catholic apologetics playlist, and I have several of your videos on there. Like I said,
I appreciate that. Yeah.
And so I think we'll deal a little bit with that after you tell your story. But just so the viewers at home know, if it seems like I'm a little bit rushed, for some reason, my power is freaking out of my house, and so I can't charge my laptop, so we're on a short amount of time here. So I'm going to go ahead and remove myself and let you get to your story, Jeff.
Okay, so I'm in the greater Philadelphia area. I grew up there too. I was raised in a nominal Catholic house, post-Vatican II house. My father was a nominal Baptist. We never really went to church or anything like that, but he was raised Baptist. I didn't know my grandparents, my paternal grandparents growing up. I believe they were I think they were more religious from what I was told than my father. But anyway, and my mom did not care for the nuns who beat people in Catholic school. But around the time I wasn't raised anything until I was 5. My mom decided, hey, it's time to go back to church or whatever. Not that she wasn't a trad or anything like that, or she didn't become super conservative Catholic. So I got dragged at the age of 5. Did not really appreciate that at the age of 5. So I made sure when I had kids, get them used to church before they can remember, so they don't have that reaction. Not that I was planning to do something different, and then I was baptized at the age of 7, and just didn't really feel like going to church too much. We went to public school, so we did CCD, which is I think the continuing Catholic something. I don't know. We called it Central City Dump when we were kids, but we never liked that. That was an hour after school, on Mondays or something like that. Anyway, got confirmed at 13. After confirmation, didn't really go to church too much, maybe every once in a while. And then after, at the age of 16, I'm sophomore in high school. I'm next in my Spanish class. I was next to an evangelical Christian who's still a friend of mine. And we I don't know if it was due to being near him or whatever. I just got the thought in my mind, like, hey, I want to know why the apostles. I knew enough why the apostles died for what they believed in, so I decided to read the book of Acts. And then by the time I got to about Acts 8 or 9, I got. I would have. I wouldn't say. I don't know if I would call it like audible, but I got like a very clear message in my head that I'm pretty sure I had the distinct feeling was not me. That said, "This is my word." So around about that point, so that was over 30 years ago now. I became a Christian. Uh, so I guess that would. I never was a strict cessationist due to that experience, and then I became I uh, would go to mass more often because of that. My friend would take me to his Pentecostal church, and then I became and then about it took about a year before I transitioned um out of the Catholic Church, and it wasn't I probably didn't have a fully developed, like, oh, these are the errors of Rome or something, but just something felt off, and there's things I don't have a very clear memory, but I would read my Bible and this, and it's like they didn't seem like the fully developed Roman Catholicism I wasn't really seeing in Scripture. And so I transitioned out. I wasn't doing like apologetics against Roman Catholicism or anything like that. Just went to Pentecostal. But I also started based on a visit to a Messianic Jewish congregation, got really fascinated with that sort of thing, and then became very involved and have been involved since then with Jewish apologetics, which, if I had my preference, would be my main form of apologetic work. It just in the last 10 years or so has not worked out like that. And because if I had to read anything theological, it mainly be about finding the Messiah or the Trinity or things like that in the Old Testament. That would be my preferred area of just, if I wanted to study something, that would be what I would study. So then I would encounter a Catholic I was always geared towards doing evangelism or apologetic work. I guess I like to argue, and then mostly Jewish apologetics. And I went to work for the founder of Jews for Jesus. I was an intern for him for a summer. I attended a Messianic congregation while in college for a couple of years, just while I was at college, and my Pentecostal church while I was at home. And and apologetic wise, interacted with a lot of atheists, especially in college. So a lot of atheists are in kind of the early days of the internet, which was easier to come by when you had a free internet connection in college. So about the same time, kind of early college, I started listening to. I'd be up late. I would listen to Christian radio a lot. My local station, which was based out of Trenton, back then had a really good range and stuff. And then I would get a midnight showing of R.C. Sproul, his Renewing Your Mind broadcast. Love that. Lived off of that show for years. And his first series I said was on Martin Luther, and R.C. Sproul is just an amazing communicator. And then so I was hooked. And then his second thing was on Calvinism, and I was just like, Calvinist, like still exist. And I've heard of the term Calvinist, but based on my world, this wasn't, again, this isn't pre-internet where you don't run into all sorts of people online and stuff. So I became convinced that forced me to go to the scriptures. I became convinced of being a Calvinist, and then I stayed in the kind of the Pentecostal world while being Calvinist. Now in the Pentecostal world, I was too my church went a little wacky with the Toronto blessing thing. If anybody remembers that, you might be too young for that, but that was a lot of like the holy laughter, that sort of thing. That was big in the 90s, that sort of thing. And I don't want to go into details, but I had some bad experiences with that. So I think I've noticed a lot of things are kind of, you can overreact. I think based on theology developing and other things, I went into the PCA world. In retrospect, I don't know how much of it was conscious or whatever, but I was kind of happy to be away from like the Pentecostal craziness thing. In retrospect, I think in the Reformed world, I don't want to make this a blanket statement, but the world is a lot more supernatural than we give it credit for, and I think there is a lot of overreaction to the Pentecostals, and I just gotta be or like Pentecostal, when they go overboard, sometimes I think we go overboard the other way. Now, getting back to the Catholicism thing, so basically based on online stuff, I became more involved with I was just interacting with Catholics online, so would brush up on that and stuff. And I think it also, through the influence of James White and R.C. Sproul, kind of stayed up on that. Would engage in polemics online with, and I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, with Catholic, and kind of have a more detailed version of like, oh, what's in my head, as opposed to kind of like a more intuitive leaving of the Catholic Church that I did before. And I think I'm in a unique position, which we can get into later, with Roman Catholicism, because I never really found the claims to the based on Roman Catholic apologetics is very much an amalgam of things you see from atheists online and from Orthodox Jews online. Appeals to authority and skepticism, basically. And so Catholic apologetics never really had any deep effect on me, if that makes sense. And then maybe however many years ago, I found out that the Pope Francis, that was 2014, I found out, but Pope Francis was coming to Philadelphia. So I became so I led an evangelistic outreach in Philadelphia when the World Meeting of Families came to Philadelphia. And since then, I've been very involved in Catholic apologetics. And anytime I try to, like, okay, I'm not going to do Catholic apologetics, I keep getting dragged back in. Either due to algorithms online or other stuff, or just because I have knowledge of it now and it's helpful. But I've been doing Jewish evangelism for years. I've been working with people from Jews for Jesus. I'm a associated with Ami Ministry, which is a very small outfit. It's kind of the kind of guy who runs it is kind of semi-retired now, but he ran that ministry for years. My friend Ron Elkin, and before he moved down to Florida, we would do a lot of evangelism in Philadelphia, and oddly enough, the Philadelphia area has a very strong connection to having reformed ministries to Jewish people for well over 100 years, which is kind of a historical oddity, I think. You don't see that too much nowadays. Or specifically reformed outreach to Jewish people. So that's and then during the pandemic, I started getting more into paranormal stuff, which led me to find links. Since everything in the paranormal is linked together, that helped me find links to Marian apparitions and UFOs and things like that.
Those videos are particularly interesting, by the way, on your channel.
So that's pretty much my story without going, or at least of the spiritual side of my story. I mean, I have other boring stuff and that sort of thing. Like, hey, I have a job and I have kids and a wife and that sort of thing.
I think that was great. I just so you know, I put it here in our chat for like 30 seconds. My Wi-Fi went out again, so we should be good now. We're working off my hotspot, but we may have missed like 30 seconds between you being in college and then finding out about Calvinism.
Okay.
But that's okay. That was great. I like people telling their story because a lot of the time I find obviously the facts and good arguments are what's most important. But for a lot of people, it really helps them digest the proper information when they have a story to attach that the person arguing to.
Yeah.
I think that's great. So my first question for you is, you mentioned in your story, right, that by the time you had encountered Roman Catholic apologetics, even though you grew up nominally Catholic and going to mass here and there and stuff, you didn't really encounter their apologetics until much later, right, until you had already left Roman Catholicism, right, and until, and after you had already been dealing with atheist apologetics and Orthodox Jewish apologetics and the sort. And so what similarities, which you kind of alluded to a second ago, what similarities did you find between the tactics across each of those apologetics fields, like the Orthodox Jewish field?
Yeah. I'll be really simple with that. Now, most of Roman Catholicism that I encounter, maybe it's different in the Deep South or something like that, but like where I am in the Northeast, it's like it's not even as cultural as it was when I was growing up. It was because the Irish and Italian communities are several generations in immigrant wise now, and a lot of intermarriage and stuff like that. So it's almost except for maybe the Hispanic immigrants or something like that, it's a lot of squishy post Vatican II Catholicism, right? So it's that's what I grew up in, and but I have memories from hearing stories from my parents, like, hey, your uncle wasn't allowed to go to Cub Scouts because it met in a Protestant church. So any story about so when I hear trads online, it's like, I know they're defending a museum piece. They're not defending Catholicism on the ground. Maybe, at least not in this country. Maybe in Poland and not even Poland. You can see the stats or something like that. You can see Ireland vote in abortion or something like that, right? So there's Catholicism on the ground, and there's a lot of times when we're arguing with the trads online, and we're trying to reach them. But your average Catholic, you just treat like a normal person. I'm just going to give a gospel message, and I'm not going to be like, well, let me tell you about the Council of Trent. No one cares about the Council of Trent.
Yeah.
Okay? Like, for the vast majority of Catholics you meet online or in the real world, that this does not matter. I don't know what the figures are, but like how many, even the quote unquote trads I talk to, like in real life, not online, how many of them think Protestants are heretics or whatever? Probably extremely minuscule, that sort of thing. Maybe the internet and some other stuff has caused, like, you know, how there's a revival in Calvinism due to online influence, and John MacArthur and R.C. Sproul. There might be a similar effect with Catholic trads, but in the real world, they're extremely small, at least by me. I couldn't tell you what the percentage of the Catholic world is there. So I think we always have to keep that in mind. And a lot of times we argue against, we're arguing against 16th century Catholicism, or what they think is 16th century Catholicism. That doesn't exist anymore. And sometimes I argue with it, but I know I'm just pretending, if that makes sense. Like, and a lot of this is, so a lot of what I'm going to tell you is like, oh, how Catholics argued or something like that is also pre-Francis. Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm not. How old are you?
I am 23.
Okay. So you probably have no good memory of Catholic apologetics like pre-Francis.
No, yeah. No.
Like, so they could like make claims. They would say things like the Pope is the source of unity, and the Pope this and the Pope that. And it's like, so we're about 10 years into Francis, and like, so if you rewound to like the late 90s or whatever, when it was Pope John Paul II, who still, by historical terms, was rather liberal, but, you know, compared to Francis, is like, you know, heading the Inquisition or something like that. They're you know, it's like, if you could go back, if I could go back in a time machine and be like, hey, here's your Pope, like that would have been awesome. But it's like the slow, it's like the slow frog boil, right? Like, you turn the temperature up, you know, that old analogy. You turn that up slowly, right?
And I know that's something that James White talks about a lot.
Yeah,
the writing line.
Well, because he's been doing it even longer than I've been around, you know, and he's been doing this faithfully for years, which is such a blessing. But it's like, so to me, like, it's part of it is like, okay, we're gonna like, I this is going to sound dismissive, and I don't mean to make this sound dismissive, but it's like arguing with a transgender person. It's like, okay, I'm going to like pretend you believe this. You know, like, where they do believe it, but a lot of it, I think, might be at this point a sunk cost fallacy. Like, the people who converted like pre-Francis is like, you must have some buyer's remorse, you know? But you're so far in now, like, there's no way these people would have some of these people would have converted prior to Francis. So a lot of the arguments were the Pope provides X, Y, and Z, is now like Catholicism in general does X, Y, Z.
Yeah.
So those arguments have transitioned. So and I think with the perspective of time, even though I like the young bucks, paying attention to when Dr. White starts talking about like those changes over time is important. Okay, so what I saw is, so atheists, if you've ever argued with atheists, you know that they have a lot of appeals to skepticism, right? They're using skeptical arguments and that sort of thing. How do you know? That's just your opinion. That's just your interpretation, that sort of thing. Those things have been around for years. If you look up like R.C. Sproul and that's just your interpretation, I know there's at least one good Renewing Your Mind episode on that or something like that, or lecture and stuff like that.
That's the classic, even like Matt Dillahunty dodge of, well, I'm just not convinced. when you provide evidence.
Yeah. I remember doing the more before I was more presuppositional, doing an evidential like case in college. Only like one person showed up, and the person's like, "I believe what you say, but I don't want to believe." And I think that was one of the major incidents that when I did encounter presuppositionalism, I was like, okay, this makes sense. Like in a Romans 1 sort of way. And then, okay, so, but the other thing is, if you're ever doing Jewish apologetics, you have to get Dr. Michael Brown's Answering Jewish Objections, volumes 1 through 5. But if you're doing Roman Catholic apologetics, I highly, highly, highly recommend perusing one or two of those volumes. I forget which one, but maybe the fifth one, which is Orthodox Jewish Arguments.
All right, everybody. We're going to continue on with our conversation right now. As I say on the channel a lot, unfortunately, which I'm trying to work on, is it wouldn't be a stream or a recording on my channel without technical difficulties. And so we had a little bit of those, although this time it was the fault of the apartment complex that I live at, because they had some issue with the breakers and a bunch of stuff went down with the power. But now we're back. And so where we left off, you were talking about some of the, rather, how dealing with atheist apologetics and Orthodox Jewish apologetics had prepared you for dealing with Roman Catholic apologetics when you encountered them, and then some of the
just
similarities between the two.
If we cover a little bit of the same information, yeah, forgive me, it's been literally 2 days, so in my time. All right, so Catholic apologetics at the popular level, okay, not the scholars, but at the popular level, because the scholars will tell you stuff like, yeah, the early papacy didn't exist. Okay. But like Catholic academic, one thing you need to learn is that Catholic academics is way more honest than with the data, at least to themselves, than Catholic apologetics. So I was doing stuff with atheists, which rely a lot on skepticism, and I was doing a lot on in the Messianic Jewish world. And I was working with Jews for Jesus. I was attending for a couple of years in college, at least, a Messianic congregation. I was doing Jewish ministry. So I'm not sure when, maybe starting in the late 90s, I would start involving myself with, like, just online back and forth with Catholics and that sort of thing. And when my first encounter with Catholic apologetic claims was like, they're using the skepticism of they're using the skepticism of atheists, okay, and they're using very similar arguments to Jewish apologetics. So in the Jewish apologetics, we can hit that first. A lot of it was like the claims to authority, like, the we gave you the Bible sort of stuff, the unbroken, that we have a tradition going to the apostles sort of thing. And when you push back on that with Catholics, it becomes sort of amorphous. But let me give you an example. So I'm looking at the volume 5, part 6 of Answering Jewish Objections by Dr. Michael Brown. This is just from the table of contents. Let's see if any of these from the table of contents sound somewhat familiar. Like, we have an unbroken authoritative chain of oral tradition going back to Moses. Who are you to teach us what our Bible says? Does that like ring any bells, right? On several occasions, the written Torah makes references to Torahs in the plural, meaning 2 Torahs. This obviously refers to a written and oral Torah. Kind of like, hey, by hand or by letter, right? Something like that. According to Deuteronomy, the rabbis have the sole authority to interpret the law and to tell us how to live. Whoever refuses to listen to them is guilty of a serious sin in the sight of God. And there's stuff like this. Various passages in the Tanakh demonstrate the biblical figures such as Daniel follow the rabbinic traditions. And there's other things like, basically, you can't understand the Torah without the oral Torah. Okay? So think of that as unwritten tradition. So this is our Bible. Our rabbis have the authority to interpret it. So you can't really tell us it talks about Jesus. And every once in a while, if you follow me on Twitter, you'll notice I will retweet posts with quotes from Catholic apologists or Catholic laymen or trads or that sort of thing, where I was saying, if the Catholic apologetic argument is true, I should become an Orthodox Jew. And it's not because so much of the similarities in the argument, but because, well, something to do with that. But it's the Old Testament. The New Testament relies on the Old for verification. Okay, their counter is going to be something about Jesus. It's like, but Jesus's verification relied on the previous scriptures. So if I take Catholic arguments that you gave me the Bible, then you should become an Orthodox Jew.
And by the way, that is one that I, curiously enough, as much as in a lot of these channels, they like to poke fun at, James White's arguments from the 90s, and they haven't evolved, and he always just quotes the same stuff, and the people that like him quote the same stuff. As much as a lot of the Roman Catholic apologists on the other side like to say that, I don't know that I've heard any good answer for why, to your point, why their argument about the New Testament and how do you know who gave you the New Testament? I've never heard them give a good follow-up response to the question, okay, but what do you do with the Old Testament, right? There wasn't a papacy in the Old Testament, right? Like, and Jesus was appealing to the Old Testament when he's dealing with the Pharisees and with the Sadducees, and he expected them to know it was the Word of God. Well, what do you guys do with that?
Yeah, they sit on the seat of Moses, do whatever they tell you. It was like, I don't think this is proving what you want it to prove.
Yeah. I'm really happy that you bring that up, because that's something that I've been saying and thinking for a while now. Is I'm like, man, it is, and that's something that I actually got first from I think things that you've said on your channel, which is, wow, like this stuff is strikingly similar, the way that some of these points are being made, and it's like, and I sometimes I feel like it just goes way over their head.
I think, to be fair, like, I think I was in a unique position just in terms of how life developed for me and what I encountered when, that I can understand how those arguments have an impact on people, especially if they don't get the counter reply. But for me, they didn't have an impact on me prior to the counter reply, because I saw them in a different context by a different group, right? And then logically, I know that the old precedes the new, so it's like, we gave this to you. I mean, also, a lot of these apologetics rely on Eastern Orthodox, forgetting the Eastern Orthodox exist.
Yeah.
So now sometimes they'll make Catholics will make arguments like, all these apostolic churches agree on, like, say something about Mary or icons or something like that. Like, that proves anything.
Yeah.
That doesn't prove anything. About 200 AD. It may have some evidential value, but it may not. But to me, so that also shows, like, well, that means that it's a game of, they're not consistent. Like, I guess I want to get out of this interview is, like, just kind of lessons learned. And one of my lessons learned is, like, Catholic apologetics is like nailing Jello to a wall. Like, you're not going to disprove them per se, because if I show that, hey, the Apocrypha has errors in it, they're just going to redefine scripture to allow for pious fiction.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, and the same thing happens in a lot of, again, this category. I really like this title. I was talking about this with the other Paul in a previous video, because I think he was the first one to coin it. But the equivalent to Protestantism as an umbrella would be something like ecclesialism on the other side, right?
Right. Yeah.
Covering the Eastern Orthodox and the Roman Catholics, the Assyrian Church of the East, and all of these different, where like they have these tangential connections, or they have like certain core things that they all kind of agree on, you know, and it's enough to create an umbrella category, but there's no actual institutional unity between them.
No.
And I feel like it's just very it's very it's interesting to me seeing how they all then, most of them end up having that same tactic that you're talking about, where it just becomes about obfuscating and dodging. Like there's
I don't know how much.
good,
I don't know how much is done
there's a
consciously.
really good YouTube channel called Ancient Paths TV that puts out some arguments and like documentary type arguments against different things. And they put one out very recently on like Cyril Lucaris and how he was a Calvinist patriarch, and he was martyred because of that at the time of the Reformation on the Eastern Orthodox side of things. And immediately, what happens in the comments as he's demonstrating, like, hey, a lot of this supposed infallible teaching of the Eastern Orthodox Church, found in some of their hagiography, found in some of their hymns, that to them that's a really big deal, found in some of the councils, like the Council of the Scythians in this situation, or the council organized by the Scythians. And man, these are just completely based on false history, and it's verifiably false. And suddenly in the comments, immediately you have Eastern Orthodox apologists that are like, "Oh, but really, the hagiographies are not about historical truth. They're actually about this other thing." And there's always a way to get out of it, you know?
Yeah, you got to be careful. So, let's try to like not be hypocrites here. All right, one thing I learned, I was a philosophy and computer science major. One of the things I learned in philosophy classes, I remember a professor saying, like, one of the ways we kind of argue, we come to a argument, is that we start with our premises, we start with and our conclusions, and then we kind of like try to meet in the middle when we're coming up with an argument, and that's fair. And so the issue with Roman Catholicism is that they've said, hey, we're infallible.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is a problem mainly for the trads, right? Like your average Roman Catholic doesn't care. Like if they told, I don't even know if like most of the magisterium cares. Like if they found, if like, yeah, Trent did something right, or when we found like the recent stuff this year with Gavin Ortland, where with the icon veneration, like one of the major counter replies by not every, but a lot of Roman Catholic apologetics is that, well, Nicaea 2, or the reasoning is not infallible, but the conclusions are. Like, what do you do with that? You know what you do with that? You just say, you're done your work. You've shown, like, the fact that they have to go through all these gymnastics, you're done at that point, okay? You don't have to keep arguing. It's like, you've done your work, because they're going to keep going through gymnastics and that sort of thing.
And that's where a lot of the theory of development does a lot of the heavy lifting.
Yeah, where it does. I coined the phrase "slap some Newman on it," and I was like, I told Paul, like, Paul, make a meme, like the other Paul, my friend. I was like, make a meme, like with the Billy Mays guy or whatever, and he did one better, and he made the whole video way better than anything I had imagined.
It's so funny.
It's like the best thing he's ever done. He did an amazing job on it, where it was like slap some. Have you seen that video?
Yeah, it's hilarious. And I know James White loves that video too.
James White loves that. He mentions it in lectures and stuff like that. It's the greatest thing.
That's so funny. I didn't realize you came up
maybe
with
that'll
that.
be my lasting contribution to apologetic discourse, is the phrase "slap some Newman" on it, with Paul being the one who launched it into public consciousness. So, but the thing, okay, so the problem is, and Steve Hayes, I don't know if he recently passed away a few years ago. He was a really good, really good apologist. He helped launch the Trio blog.
Oh, okay.
Very smart guy. He had some articles on this. So if you want to really think of Christianity as kind of like a forest, right? And I hold to Calvinism pretty strongly. Maybe limited atonement less strongly than total depravity, but I still believe in limited atonement, right? If someone disproved Calvinism, I'm not going to just abandon Christianity, right? Might become a Lutheran or a 4-point Calvinist, or so but at some point you have to have a breaking point, right? Where, okay, the Bible's fallible, but I think it's, Jesus still rose from the dead and the Bible's generally reliable. I don't think that's true. I think that would have really, really serious consequences to the faith, But even if you disprove Christianity, you don't have to go to atheism, right? That's not, I can still, for my paranormal investigation, say, hey, there's still supernatural stuff in the universe. And so, but at some point, there's a breaking point where, like, okay, if Jesus isn't risen from the dead, or if the Bible is not true, well, but Catholicism has made everything infallible, or like the church is infallible. That's the non-negotiable for Catholicism. So I've heard someone say, essentially what's the non-negotiable for Protestants is Scripture, for Eastern Orthodox it's liturgy, and for Roman Catholics it's power. All right, so they can't give up the fact. So because they said, hey, we're infallible, new data has come in, so then now we got to go development and super hyper qualify, as opposed to, if you're a Protestant, you can say, you know what, I'm wrong, or maybe I understood something wrong. And I think this gets to, I think one of the most important videos I did was a I forget what I exactly called it, but
it has to do with psychology of the Roman Catholic
converts.
Yeah.
Okay,
really good video.
I had a viewer, I forget his name. Some other people, R. Scott Clark, tried to call it, came up with the acronym QUERC, which is Quest for something religious certainty, illegitimate religious certainty. But I had a viewer, and I didn't really, that's not too, I can understand, QUERC is at least, but I always called it before that, like, there's an existential angst. But my viewer labeled it the safety net syndrome. And this shows up all over society, not just religion, but also in every religious sect. Okay. And it shows up in different ways in different groups. But it's, I think, the main, and this gets to the skepticism versus the Jewish stuff, the Jewish esque arguments, the authority arguments, right? Is the main driver for a lot of these converts, not the, hey, my wife is Catholic and she wants to get married in the church, so, and I don't care. I'm a nominal Lutheran. I'm a nominal Methodist. I'm Catholic now, right? Not those people, but for a lot of the online types, it's the safety net syndrome, which is, oh, there's all this division. oh, who's going to tell me? The big one, I think, is who is going to tell me uh, there's all these competing interpretations. How can I know I'm right? And they freak out. And I've even within the last week, I've had someone on Twitter say, if you prove Catholicism was wrong, the only viable alternative is like atheism.
Yeah, I've seen
And
that.
like that's insane, right? But to them, it's like Rome grounds them. So you have to think if you're in a if you're a presuppositionalist, you have to think like you're presupposing that some maybe not all of the truths of Scripture, but at least the core truths of Scripture, right? And then their presupposition is the church. They just kind of move it kind of a step. Is really what's going on. But just to show like how this, maybe it would be better example if I can show the safety net syndrome in a non-Catholic context. In a non-Catholic context, it would look like King James onlyism. Okay, where there's these textual variants. So you can either, if you have the safety net syndrome in your head, right, you can go one or two ways with those textual variants. You can go Bart Ehrman, right, where it's like, well, then all this literalistic fundamentalist stuff is wrong, and so instead of adjusting your views to just be like normal, okay, you go to the opposite extreme. You can go to the opposite extreme from Bart Ehrman and just become a King James onlyism. And where it's like, well, why are you arbitrarily picking this text? Like, why not another Bible translation? Why this set of underlying texts that undergird the King James version?
Well, and that's I was saying, and that's what I get to a lot with and I did like an introductory video on the canon. I think it was like maybe my second video on this channel, and it had to do with dealing with the whole where's the infallible table of contents like type argument that we hear in pop apologetics all the time, our Roman Catholic friends. And to this day, I'm still like about that video and regarding that video, I'm still having back and forths with Roman Catholics in the comments because it's like they do. It's for some of them, it's like they do not understand. For some reason, in their mind, they're like they don't see the issue with having an infallible saying, "Oh no, there is no such thing as self-authentication. You must always have external authentication, and it must be by an infallible source if you're going to talk about the thing that's being authenticated also being infallible." And it's like once you ask them, "Well, wait a minute. Sure, you kick the can down the road, but now how do you authenticate the magisterium?" It's almost like they can't process that, and it's
they
like
can't.
No.
For a lot of them, no, they can't process that. They are presupposing Rome, and their arguments against us when applied to Rome would blow everything up.
Yeah.
But there's just a disconnect. I frankly view it as spiritual blindness.
Well, and let me ask you a question because that's a good segue when it comes to dealing with some of these points, right? Again, even in something as simple as just explaining, hey, this is one of my biggest things from when I was anxious about this stuff myself. One of the things
It's
that
a
helped snap
natural
me out of
tendency.
it.
We've all had it. Like I've had it. Like, oh, how do I figure things out? And what it is you don't want to be wrong. It's hard. Like who to know, who to trust. It's but it's just the lot we have in life.
Oh, no, absolutely. And the thing is, one of the things that really kind of, or two of the things that helped snap me out of that was realizing, wait a minute, we're all in the same epistemic boat here.
Yeah.
Right? Like we all have to interpret things. We all have to do the best with the information that we've got. We all have to operate on faith here on the Christian realm, an evidence-based faith. But at the end of the day, I mean, we got to make a judgment call eventually. And also, along with that, it was understanding, man, what you said, which is we're all in the same boat, and here are these guys poking holes in the boat, or trying to poke holes at least, because they're like, oh, if I just poke holes in this boat, I'll sink that guy. But it's like, dude, we're on the same boat.
Well,
what you're attempting to do doesn't make any sense.
in the last however many years, through a friend who actually lives in Singapore, and I think it spread around the internet because I discovered it from him and people connected to me, and now it seems to be more well known. Well, maybe it's from other sources besides me, but I don't want to take credit for it, but because like I never did any of the heavy lifting. I just like consumed the internet and passed on what I found was cool. You know, in the Protestant Counter-Reformation, from the Catholics, from the Jesuits, they dug up ancient Greek skepticism.
Yep.
And once you realize this, then you're like, oh, I've seen this in modern Catholic apologetics. So they don't realize, like, we're going to use skepticism and then to blow everything up, right? But then we're going to come in riding in like a white knight onto the battlefield. And, oh, thank you, Rome, for clarifying everything. And I'm sitting here looking at these people, and it's like, it has to be something psychological, right? Like, oh, it satisfies something for them. Like, they think it solves something, but it's like, you got Pope Francis. You have a myriad of like church documents that, like, how on earth are you going to sift through all that? Like, and just because once you unleash Frankenstein's monster, it doesn't arbitrarily stop at the gates of Rome. And
I will say,
I don't understand how they don't see this.
Yeah, well, and that's one of the things that got me too. Is I was like, okay, we could sit here all day and ask, well, how do you infallibly know? How do you infallibly know? Do you have Cartesian certainty? Do you have Cartesian certainty?
I don't infallibly know. I'm a creature, man.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like we can sit around and we can play those games, but to your point, that hyper skeptical monster doesn't stop at the gates of Rome. It barrels right on through them. You know, it's like, and if we're gonna sit here and play that game, then I guess we could all just sit here in a hyper skeptical daze, you know, until the end of our days. But that's not going to benefit anybody. And
I always wonder, like, do they argue with atheists? Yeah. Do they?
And I will say, that's the thing that's amazing for me is, I say this on the channel all the time. Whenever I mention Trent Horn, I actually greatly, I like a certain.
He's very fair, I think.
He's one of the more fair apologists, and also I really love his work with atheists. I love his work on abortion and his work on so many of these other things. But one of the things that just amazes me, for example, when I see his content, is I'm like, wow, there's a level of excellency here dealing with all these other worldviews. And he doesn't let them get away with this hyper skeptical situation. But then I feel like when he's dealing with Protestantism, he kind of, like, it's a lot more okay to get into these games about the canon and to get into these games. How do you know that you know that you know that you know? And it's like, I think he is more fair than others. But this is
he's you know? I think of the one of the fairest. I really like Trent, and I like him personally. I've interacted with him. I got to mention, like, oh, I thought Fatima was a demonic UFO event on his channel. Okay,
I have to watch that video.
And like watching Trent, like, I'm going to not be like, what are you talking about? Like, it was great. He's a great guy. You can't fluster him.
No, he's a cool guy. But even then, for Catholic Answers, there's a lot of these hyper skeptical strategies that are kind of trotted out.
Yeah,
and you know, and I don't know how they deal with that when it's turned back on them.
I don't understand. I don't understand how they don't see it, and I attribute it to, like, I don't want to attribute it to, like, I don't think every Catholic is unsaved, but the people who traffic in this, I, like, really wonder about. If that makes sense.
Yep. Well,
I
so let me ask you a question then. When it comes to dealing with some of the stuff, like the hyper skeptical, uh, how do you know that you know that you know that you know when it comes to dealing with some of these claims to authority? And again, I've had people that have personally told me and come to me with their concerns. Protestants who are dealing with this stuff. They're like, man, it just even with the authority stuff. Like I've heard it said, like, oh man, it seems so scary to me. If it's just me versus this magisterium, like, what are the odds that I'm right? Like, this really gets in people's heads. And so my next question for you is like, what are some strategies that you would recommend to people for dealing with Roman Catholic apologetics, right? Like, how should people
okay.
that have these
So
questions evaluate those
a lot of times when I had a successful intervention with someone once, and it took a while. Like they encountered all this, and I guess I met him through Facebook or something back when I used to be on Facebook. I'm not on Facebook anymore. um, is kind of showing it's more useful before they're in. Okay, so because before once they commit, there's like a sunk cost fallacy. It's almost like I don't know. It's like I think a lot of people deconvert because they want to sleep with their girlfriend. Okay, and um, you want to cut off the issue. The first thing you want to do is make sure they're not sleeping with their girlfriend, because then like the skeptical arguments just like are almost something that they like latch on to excuse something else. Okay, that's in a different context or whatever. But like once you commit to Rome, or for whatever reason you want Rome to be true, like arguments are not going to do much,
claims?
if that makes sense. So you kind of want to prepare the body ahead of time. So for me, like the Jewish apologetics and the working with atheists were almost like antibodies against Rome. Uh, if that makes sense. And also my personal experience where I was baptized at 7. I can remember being baptized, and then I can remember being regenerated at the age of 16. So when someone's talking to me about, say, automatic baptismal regeneration, I'll be like, I was unregenerate after being baptized for like 9 years. What are you talking about? Like, I knew I could see the before and after in my life. So if you became a Christian at 3, that's much a blessing. But having in your mind like a before and after you were regenerated is also a blessing, because before I would read the Bible and it would be like a dead letter, right? And afterwards it wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
Where it's almost like with when Paul talks about Jews who with avails over, it's like I completely understand that was me. So
Yeah, well, and I think that's a good point that you make, which is so it sounds so far two things that you've said here. One is sometimes, and you kind of alluded to this earlier until your philosophy professor talking about this, is a lot of the time people like a given conclusion or they like a given result, and then we just kind of have to meet halfway to make it happen.
we
And
have
I
our
think
premises and we have our conclusions, and it's like let's try to figure this out, and we do it. And I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with it, but we have to know that we're doing that.
yeah. And I think for some people in this debate, the Roman Catholic Protestant debate, what the big conclusion that they want to get to is, I want to know that I know that I'm in the right church, so I have a good chance of being saved. And a lot of the time, I think that anxiety, when it's allowed to fully like set in and take hold,
Yes.
suddenly it's well, we're just gonna throw everything else out of the way, and we'll do whatever we got to do to get here. And I feel like at that point the game is kind of rigged. To your point,
so we probably want to have like arguments against skepticism in general. I'm not sure if I'm the best to do that. I guess against atheism, people are just like, you can be like, well, I know that's design. I've done a lot of work in the intelligent design world. Okay. So that helps, even though that's empirical or whatever. And I think if you've been regenerated, you have a general sense of like, okay, I know atheism isn't true. Proving it is another thing, right? So it's easier to know than to prove sometimes. Yeah, but that general anxiety is like, well, the one thing I would say to Catholics or people like looking at Catholicism is, I don't you you you're not off the hook. Just read the New Testament, okay? You're not off the hook because you have to do the work yourself. And you can't hide behind a magisterium. You can't hide against the Pharisees or the seat of Moses or something like that, right? When Jesus came, it's like, well, the magisterium, the Sanhedrin is telling me I shouldn't believe in Jesus. Is that going to work? And it's not going to work on the final day. Well, like, oh, you rejected justification by faith alone, but that's okay because the magisterium told you otherwise.
Well, and that's the next thing I want to get to. My next question here, but before I get to that, another comment I wanted to make to your point is, when it comes, especially I think with a lot of the skepticism, and there's a lot tomes upon tomes of very rigorous anti hyper skeptical Christian works out there from philosophers that know I have a lot more than than I do, or I'm sure both of us do. But that being said, even on a common level, though, when it comes to our own experience, right? Something that for me, right, because I love apologetics, even just actual, just dealing with atheism. I want to do some of that on the channel in the future as well. Right now, I'm focused on this area though, because I feel like this is the most felt.
There's so much work done with atheism. I feel like I didn't want to cover that ground.
But here's the thing, right? One of the most, and again, this is very entry level, low level point to make to an atheist, but it's one that I find resonates with a lot of people that I've talked to. Is, especially when we're talking about moral relativism and we're talking about the objectivity of morality or whether it's relative, and we're having these discussions. Something that is the most low level, entry level point ever, but it really resonates, and I think because it speaks to people's experiences. When you bring up something as simple as like, man, but do you actually live this way? Does it actually match your experience, right? Or like that this is just a feeling that you have. It's just your personal preference that people shouldn't horribly abuse children, or it's your personal preference that something that you would deem horrible, like the Holocaust, happened.
Why really is it only in the religious context? You're saying?
And for me, it's like, well, when I'm talking with an atheist on a very low stakes conversation, one of the things that I appeal to is like, well, but this does actually match your experience, right? Does it match your experience that these things are just you're an emotivist, and these are just these feelings, preferences that you have, or does it match your experience more that when you hear of some atrocity, you're like, no, there's an actual injustice that has taken place that is outside of myself. And as entry level of a point as that is, and there's a bunch of more robust atheist rebuttals and back and forth. That's one point that I found, interestingly enough, really resonates with people, because they're like, no, you know what? You're right. I don't think that does match my experience. And the reason I bring that up is, for me, one of the first steps when I was started dealing with this stuff was realizing, well, wait a minute. Can we really only function on infallible knowledge for things to be steadfast, or for things to be? It's like, in what other realm of life does this ever take place? I don't infallibly know that my wife loves me. I don't infallibly know anything. Right? So it's like, why would it's like that hasn't stopped me from making meaningful decisions up until this point.
You can be sure about your dog and maybe your mom. I've seen too many women over the years just all of a sudden flip on their husband and divorce them, even in the Christian world. But it's completely reasonable to feel that your wife loves you, but one day she could just
And that's exactly the point, right? It's we don't infallibly know these things, but yet It happens each and every day of our lives that we make judgment calls with the evidence that we have, and we know, like, hey, I am justified at making this judgment. Like all the evidence I have points me in this direction, and it doesn't really bother us in our day to day that we don't have infallible knowledge. But suddenly, when we try to play that game in our faith, right, and when we try to play that game when it comes to the magisterium, suddenly we're supposed to just drop everything and be like, well, I guess unless I have infallible knowledge, nothing is ever really meaningful or steadfast, or why am I justified in believing it? For me, it almost becomes like parallel to when I'm having some of those conversations with
Well,
atheists.
this is like talking to a King James onlyist, right? Where I was saying that's where it shows up in the Protestant context the most often, at least in America, right? Oh, there's a textual variant. How do you know you have all of Scripture could be lost? It's like, no. Like, calm down, man.
It becomes an all or nothing game all of a sudden.
Yeah, it's like, you don't know whether Jesus said on the thief on the cross and what, And
it's interesting because that's something that I had Sean Luke of Anglican Aesthetics on the channel a little bit ago, and that's something that he talked about, that he's trying to formulate a more robust version of this argument, but putting forth the fact that, well, before you believe in the magisterium, right? Before you, or I guess you can believe in the magisterium first, but logically speaking, before you can believe in the magisterium being God given and being, you have to believe in the existence of God, and then you also have to believe that Jesus is God and that He rose from the dead. Because if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then the magisterium doesn't matter. And these are
they'll tell you they only know the resurrection. They only believe in some, not all, but some who are really far down this path in the safety net syndrome. And we need to standardize the term. And since my viewer came up with it, I'm going with safety net syndrome. People who are really far down the safety net syndrome path would even tell you that, where I said they would go atheism. So they would say, yeah, we can't know Jesus rose from the dead if Rome is not like the one true church. Yeah. That sounds crazy to me.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely.
But that's where it is. And I should also mention, like, I think another motivating factor for at least the people who fall into the safety net syndrome. I don't want to make this sound like this is everybody or all Catholics or even all Catholic converts, but this is definitely Sola Scriptura is the blueprint for anarchy, people, right? I'll call it organizational division, i.e. there's 40,000 denominations. Yeah. There's 40,000 denominations! Like, well, there's at least two denominations, right? Eastern Orthodox and Catholic, Roman Catholic. Like, why is two, like, for like just the point you're trying to make, two is no better than 40,000.
Especially when one of those two is saying that the other one is completely damned, right? That's the most consistent Eastern Orthodox position, at least the historic one. That Roman Catholics also aren't saved. And then if you take it another level beyond that, you have I think they're called the true Orthodox, right? Who they argue that not even other Eastern Orthodox are saved.
Did you see the meme I reposted from a friend?
I don't think so.
It was the Baptists are like, I'm pretty much like Presbyterians with some minor differences. And then the Presbyterians like, hey, infant baptism's like really important, so no. And then the Presbyterian is saying the same thing about the Anglican, and the Anglican's like, well, the episcopacy is really important. And then they're talking to the Catholic. The Catholic is talking to the Orthodox. The Orthodox is like, well, Filioque is a heresy. And then he's saying to the true Orthodox, and true Orthodox is like, Julian calendar, you piece of crap.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that's the thing. Once we play the all or nothing exclusivist game, because that's another appeal that I see a lot, right? Is I see a lot of I'm more on the lay level, but I think I've seen some apologists also argue this, but mainly on the lay level, people are like, well, if you think that there's some evidence on either side, why not Pascal wager this and just go with the side that has the the largest downside if you were to be wrong and you joined the wrong side.
Well,
But
since
it's
Vatican II, what's the downside of not being Catholic?
well, yeah, no, exactly, and that leads then to my following question, because a lot of the time they'll put this out there. One, like we just said, pretending as though there aren't as though there aren't sedevacantists, as though there aren't true Orthodox, as though there aren't all these other factions on that side claiming that they're the only exclusive one. But then also, when we flip that around, then we ask, well, wait a minute. But even from just the Roman Catholic and a given Protestant tradition, or even if we want to compare umbrellas, ecclesialist versus Protestant, um, even in that context, there's still potentially a lot to lose going in that direction. Yeah. So my next question for you was, what are some of the spiritually hazardous or dangerous features that you would see in Roman Catholicism that ultimately you think should keep people away from it and that kept you away from it?
Their view on justification by faith alone. Because ultimately, that requires you trusting in yourself, I believe. If you're consistent. I think there might be a case where someone believes in justification plus faith and works, and however you want to define works. But relying on the sacramental system and the stuff is like, I don't. So even if I don't want to say that automatically condemns someone, that puts you in a really, really spiritually dangerous spot. Where if I can't read Galatians and being like, oh, okay, it's okay, someone's Catholic. That's really, at the end of the day, I think the most important. So, I view, the way I view it is that, like, Mary is like the emotional tool Satan uses to wed people to a system that will deny the gospel. So we can argue about Mary all day, but I don't think someone's unsaved because of their Mariology. For the most part. Okay. It might be a sign they're unsaved, but for the most part, I don't want to make a definitive judgment on that, but I think it's more a tool that's used by Satan, if that makes sense. It's the at the end of the day, it comes down to the gospel. So when the World Meeting of Families and the Pope came to Philly, I was just focused on talking about the gospel. I wasn't gonna like get into if I only have, like, you know, in the movie industry they say an elevator pitch, like you only have the length of a time you're in an elevator with someone to talk to them. I'm just focusing on the gospel. That's the core issue. The other stuff is for more long, extended conversations. This other stuff, you know, like a lot of Catholic apologetics is me forgetting Vatican II happened. You know, and it's like, okay, I'm going to play this game because that's where you're at. You want to pretend you want to pretend there's this museum you actually live in that doesn't exist anymore. You know, that since Vatican II, and especially since Pope Francis. But sure, I'll play this game. But it's mainly about the, you know, as much as he may be, you know, not respected in some circles or whatever, Ray Comfort is completely right. Like, at the end of the day, when you're evangelizing, you should go law and gospel. Just go law and gospel. If you only have a little bit of interaction with a Catholic, just use the law and gospel, and that's essentially what I would like to. I don't when I talk with a bunch of people, be like, can you stand before God, you know, with your system? And if they say yes, and you know, this and that, and imputed righteousness is a legal fiction, and I would just say, best of luck to you, like standing before God in your inherent righteousness. Well, it's not my inherent righteousness; it's Christ's righteousness infused into me, and you know. But excuse my cough.
Well, and that's something I wanted to ask you about as well. When it comes to, I believe you put out a video giving some light pushback to, for example, even like Dr. Gavin Orland on the Galatian heresy and Roman Catholicism. So I was going to ask you, because this is a topic that comes up all the time with the other Protestants that are keyed into this debate that goes on all the time, and different people have different. I almost feel like there's a spectrum where different Protestants are at on this issue. But if I remember correctly in your video, you were arguing that you think that if, like you said, followed consistently, you think the Roman Catholic system falls into the Galatian heresy.
Yes.
And so I wanted to ask if maybe you could flesh that out a little bit.
Okay, so the Judaizers that are Paul is reacting to, they didn't deny grace. They didn't deny the deity of Christ. As far as we know, their Christology was perfectly fine. What they said is that you had to keep the Torah along with faith in Christ in order to be justified. And there is no parenthetical note. The Peter was the apostle to the Jews, according to the New Testament, and the modern Roman Catholic Church doesn't believe in any Jewish evangelism. So you succeed Peter in like everything except the one thing he was actually supposed to be. His actual office was. That's the papacy. All right. So the Torah is a bunch of ceremonial stuff, but it also contains the whole moral law. So Paul's argument in Galatians is, if you commit yourself like, hey, you have to be circumcised, you have to follow the Torah, you gotta do, there's no half measures. And the thing that would make you unable to be justified is because, according to Galatians 3, is you can't keep the whole Torah. I don't think he was talking about the reason why people can't keep the Torah is not because of the ceremonial law. They could scrupulously keep the ceremonial law. Would it stink? Yeah. What convinced Paul he was a sinner? According to Romans, it was, I think Romans 7, it was coveting. So, that's a problem. I think, so when you're saying like, hey, the measure you judge in the Sermon on the Mount, right? It's, you're judged by the measure, the measure you judge, you'll be judged. If you ask God, like, hey, I want to be judged based on inherent righteousness, then it's either 100% grace or 100% perfection. And if you try to mix the two together, it's still, well, then you have to be perfect, and I can't be perfect. I mean, how long can you even go? How long could you go, even in a regenerative state, this side of heaven, loving the Lord with 100% of your heart? And they say, well, our system doesn't demand that. We have venial sins. Well, it's not a question about what your system says. It's a question about what is actually God's standards. And God's standard is be perfect like my heavenly Father is perfect. You can water down the standard in your official teachings with venial sins or something like that and require purgatory, but that's just something you made up. The actual standard is perfection. And you don't meet it. That's what I would say. That's why that's essentially why they would fall into not the exact same thing, but the application of the Judaizing heresy.
Yeah. And I asked that question again just because I find that different people that I talk to fall in different kind of places in the spectrum of, well, some people, some Protestants will argue, well, Roman's still wrong, but it's not the same thing. Some will argue again, like, no, pretty much in essence it is the same thing. And
Oh, they
you have
mentioned
different
grace.
degrees.
Woo! Like the
Yeah.
Judaizers didn't mention grace.
Yeah. And so I think that's definitely.
I have to interrupt you here. So one of the days when I was in Philly before the Pope came, because the Pope came at like the end of the week and the weekend, I was in a train station, like handing out tracts to Catholics. There's Jehovah's Witnesses there. Walked up to them and started conversing with them. They believed in justification by grace. Specifically asked them because it's like, oh, we believe, I was told all week we believe in grace, we believe in the same things. It was and another thing I should mention. I had 4 different, in Jews for Jesus world would call broadsides, because I don't believe in like, here's a little piece of paper to hand. I have something long so that's easy to hand out, right?
Sure.
The first 2 we handed out were also geared towards non-Catholics, but it was gospel based, and no Catholic had a problem with it. Barely any interaction with Catholics. On day 3, when it's like, hey, we have a specific problem with your church, and we're laying them out, and this is what the Council of Trent says, this is what the book of Romans says, this is what the book of Galatians says. Then we had interactions galore. You want to make your differences clear, because then you can get to the heart of matter faster, because a lot of times they're confused. You want to say these are the actual differences when you want to. So if I give a general gospel message to a Catholic, you might not get the. You know how, like, if I explain Calvinism to someone, but I never use the term Calvinism. Yes. And like, hey, and like Joseph, God ordained everything for good. Oh, yeah. And God's in control. Oh, okay. And before I have to come to faith, like, God has to change my heart. Yeah. But as soon as you use the word Calvinism, they're like, oh no. You know what I mean? You understand what I'm saying? Like, sometimes you have to be explicit. I mean, you can walk someone into a trap and then lay it on them, but sometimes if you just hide things forever, it really doesn't any good, because they don't come to the recognition that, like, oh, there's this actual thing I need to deal with. Does that make sense?
And I think the same is true when you're dealing with the risk of certain things, right? Which is part of the reason I even asked that question. Because a lot of the time, we want to focus on being, and for example, I really appreciate this from Truth Unites, right? From Dr. Orland's channel. He's incredibly ironic. He's incredibly peaceful in his conversations, not just with Roman Catholics, but with atheists and everybody. And I think that's awesome. But at the same time, in certain circumstances, for some people, right, if all that they're aiming at is, and I'm not saying Gavin does this, I'm just saying, but
I love Gavin, but I do, and that's why I publicly made a response. Is I think Gavin does a lot of great work, and I think he this was a kind of a blind spot for him in terms of Catholics are committing the Judaizing heresy. One of the things that we mentioned in that video was, I think one of his, I forget where it was, I forget if it was on Twitter, was a question, I forget if it was in private, or it's been so long. But he's like, well, what about Tolkien? Right? And because you like Tolkien seems to get it. And maybe Tolkien was saved. Maybe it was just a cultural disconnect for him. I have to talk to Tolkien to know where Tolkien is. Because a lot of Catholics I talk to on the street will do the Mary stuff, but if I talk to them, it's like, oh, well, they kind of believe in justification by faith alone, even if they want to use that terminology. If that does that make sense?
Yeah. No.
So it's like I can maybe presume that they're saved, but but if I tell them like, oh, you're disagreeing with church teaching, maybe that would help get to whether they actually believe it or not. You know what I mean?
And something else that's helpful there, to your point, also is, I think it also is important. I mean, because our Roman Catholic friends or Eastern Orthodox friends, some of them can be again also incredibly ironic with us, but at the same time, the reason why I think a lot of the time this anxiety takes over for people is because you do have actors on that side that are like, no, but here's the danger, right? There's a reason why, because you have Eastern Orthodox guys that are like, hey, we're the ark, and the flood is coming, and you're standing outside the ark. Right? You have Roman Catholic people that are like, well, technically, we have to affirm that you can be saved because of some
Vatican II.
Later understandings, but really, it's not all that likely. I think the same way that they will say that to
Well,
us.
who's saying it's not very likely? Is it Pope Francis saying that?
No,
No, because it's like, hey, that atheist father had his kid baptized. So it's really justification by the good, like the college try now, giving it the good college try. Like on the ground, it's actually like worse than Pelagianism in the Catholic Church.
And that's the thing where it's important for our side as well to be able to explain, like, sure, and we're fine to say, hey, there's a chance that, like you've been saying this whole time, right? There's plenty of Roman Catholics that, by God's grace, have kind of lucked their way into into understanding the gospel the right way and have
intuitively,
and things have kind of worked out. But it's important for us to also explain, like, hey, but hold on a minute. If this system is actually followed out the way it's been laid out, it can be really dangerous, and it can be spiritually hazardous. And I think once we start laying out that groundwork, once we start explaining that too, then it's no longer just a one-sided battle where, oh, all the risk is in just me staying a Protestant versus, well, maybe I should go over there. It's like, no. There's risk involved with going over there and taking that to its logical conclusion.
Well, let's take Tolkien, for example, okay? And let's assume justification by writing Lord of the Rings is not a standard, okay? You really like Lord of the Rings, and he, or G.K. Chesterton. You really like G.K. Chesterton because he has a lot of good quips. So there's no justification by being cool, okay? Or writing like a really cool fantasy trilogy. All right. I'm losing my point here, but anyway, like you need to talk to him, right? And and being confrontational. And I think this is one thing I learned from Jews for Jesus is like you need to confront people, and that doesn't mean like we negatively, but confrontation brings clarity. So if I had Tolkien with me, I would say, what do you believe? How, the whole the diagnostic question from what was the D. James Kennedy evangelism explosion?
Okay.
So I'm not sure if you're familiar. They okay, because this predates my time, but it was still around. But evangelism explosion was very big back in maybe the 60s, 70s, into the 80s. So they would they had a diagnostic question, which is essentially, and you've heard it, but essentially, if you were going to heaven, like, why would you say you would go to heaven? That diagnostic question is gold because it really gets to, if a Catholic tells you like, because Jesus died for me or something along those lines, it's like, that's good. Yep. Okay. Like when I was doing evangelism with the Catholic, for a specific Catholic event, so I knew there was like 95% Catholics there. I wasn't trying to take them out of their church. I was trying to get the gospel across, right? So if they gave me like a good like answer to that sort of thing, I wasn't going to be like, now I need to get you out of Rome. Like I at least that wasn't that's something I would want to do on my if I was talking with someone. Like, why are you in here when you know it disagrees with Trent? Your official doctrine. Like, if you were at a bar and you knew like one of the main ingredients that's being given to customers a lot of times is cyanide, you should get out of the bar. Okay, that's just me. It's not healthy to be there, but that doesn't mean every customer is imbibing. But it doesn't mean you need to get out of there.
Yeah, I like that analogy. There's a bar that often serves cyanide, and some people are hanging out at the bar, but they're not drinking. And so maybe they haven't had it yet. But that's a good point. Well, and so let's do this. Let me ask you here. I think I'm going to speed forward to my final two questions because
Sure.
I'm trying to do the math with what we recorded today and also a couple of days ago on the interview. I want it to be crazy long. But in my mind, right, we've kind of taken this trajectory of like, okay, how did you deal with some of these objections? And you talked about how your background kind of informed your ability to be able to deal with these objections. We talked about then some of the dangers that we perceive, or that you perceive rather, on that side of things. And now I kind of want to get to the end of that, which is, what about your particular Protestant tradition? This is something that I try to talk about a lot on this channel. I just put out like an excerpt of me and Paul talking about it a little bit ago on how Protestantism is not a tradition, right? Protestantism is an umbrella that includes a lot of individual traditions in it. And in your case, right, the tradition that you belong to is Presbyterianism. And so the question I like to ask people to kind of not just, be perceived as like, oh, we're trying to poke holes in the other side, but what do we have to offer? Is what about being a Presbyterian do you find to be uniquely special in comparison with Rome, and then in comparison with other Protestant traditions?
Okay, so in terms of our form of church government, which is that, so on a congregational model, which is the generally Baptist model, is you have local churches that are ruled by in a Presbyterian world we call session, but like basically a group of elders. Maybe some Baptists do deacons, and but essentially you have a group of elders. And so that's what you have at the Presbyterian level, but also at the Presbyterian we organize on kind of a regional level too. So there's like regional accountability. The mainline denomination that we come out of when it went liberal, would force congregations to basically abandon their property. So when the PCA, which is the denomination I'm of, was formed, they allowed churches, the church building, the land and stuff belong to the local congregation. But there is accountability at higher levels. What it generally amounts to, because of the owning your own property sort of thing and a lot of stuff, is that churches can get kicked out. One of the things I would say to a Catholic or anyone else is that this is more my computer science background than an engineering background than anything else. Everything in life involves trade-offs. I think Catholics in particular are looking for and not just Catholics, but are looking for the perfect system that will solve everything. So there isn't. I don't think it's almost impossible for every church to live forever. They live and die. Their lampstands are removed, right? Or at least live forever faithfully. It's exceedingly rare. You can see this in ancient Israel, right? Things come and go, and so you have to. I think Presbyterianism has a good trade-off. I think what you saw in the early church, based on ancient sources, is kind of like they moved to a single Episcopal model, like a single head bishop model to deal with things. But that comes with trade-offs. Like, so if you're a monarchy, might be the best form of government within the church and without, but only if you have a good monarch. If you have a bad monarch, it's bad. It's the worst. So I think the Presbyterian church form of government forms a good balance. But nothing is going. If you're looking for perfection this side of heaven, you're not going to find it. It can't solve all problems. So when the PCUSA went bad, the Presbyterian model to keep local churches accountable basically meant they had to abandon their churches. The PCA model at least says, hey, we're going to kick you out. The congregational model, I don't think, is the worst model in the world. But I like having there's extra accountability. If you have a great bishop in an Episcopal model, that's a great model. But if you don't, it's the worst model. Maybe this gets back to the safety net syndrome again. For people, is that everything involves trade-offs. I mean, obviously, I'm Reformed, so Presbyterianism is Reformed. So even if you had like a Reformed congregational church, that'd be great too. But over time, you saw what happened in New England. That just happens. I highly recommend everybody study the downgrade controversy that Spurgeon had. I think that's free on like Phil Johnson's one of Phil Johnson's website. He runs a Spurgeon website. He has an excerpt from a chapter from one of John MacArthur's books. That's really, really worth it. There's not going to be perfection. That's basically what I want to say. You have to think in life in terms of trade-offs.
Yep.
Because like one of the videos I did that got like no views, but I thought was like important, there was this article on the Roman Catholic Church in China, and the Pope basically capitulates to communism. But the Protestant Church is doing well in China. It's less hard. It's harder for the communists to make all the Protestant churches capitulate, because there's not a single point of failure like there is with the Pope. So maybe the Pope, if the Pope was completely faithful, that would be the best model. But since he isn't, Protestantism, even having multiple forms of church government, multiple denominations, is like beneficial in the big picture for what Christ is trying to accomplish. Where in some instances it'll favor congregationalism, sometimes it'll favor Presbyterianism, and sometimes maybe it'll even favor the Episcopal model. So I'm not sure if that's a ringing endorsement for like, hey, choose the PCA or something like that. But I honestly want people to like be grown up about this. Is that think of the church as like it's presented in Scripture as an organism, and we're going to thrive. The church is going to thrive. The church is not going to die totally, even under intense persecution, right? But if you think of it like a farming analogy, right? When you only have one crop, a pestilence can come through and kill everything. But if you have multiple things going on, then there's not like a single point of failure.
Yeah, fair enough. And
Uh,
so,
yeah,
I think the big theme throughout this interview has been, I think you pretty much encapsulated, which has been trade-offs. And that our Roman Catholic friends are not immune to trade-offs, because that is just a part of the human life. you know.
well, they
And
want
so,
one system that will like cover everything and be perfect. It'd be like saying a lot of the Christian nationalism debate. I don't know if I'd consider myself a Christian nationalist, but I'm not. I don't really buy into the post World War II liberal consensus anymore. Is like, hey, we're looking for a political system. All these previous Christian nations like fell or descended into something else. It's like, well, can you name me like one empire that like lasted forever, or one nation that didn't have a lifespan? Like, you live, you grow, you reach maturity, you decline, you die. And so that's just the way of life, right? So it's like, well, because or you can't wield power because eventually it turns bad. Well, then somebody else is going to wield. I think you really need to have a good understanding of history. I think, history helps us test like claims. Like, so when a Catholic comes in and is like, you have to trust the church, and then he's like, well, if I was in Athanasius's shoes, then wouldn't that mean I'd have to become Arian? Because right,
yeah,
like,
fair enough.
you know what I mean, or like, if you know the whole ebbs and flows of history, then like, yeah, there's downsides and there's upsides, and you can't really avoid them. So, and this gets back to like the skepticism stuff. It's like, well, you got to be mature in what you're doing. And how you view things. You can't be like, oh, I need the one true church. It's the same. It's the same thing. I think. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
It's
No,
the
fair enough.
same. Yeah, I think it's the trade-off thing. You got to be mature about it.
Well, and on that note, I have a feeling we'll probably deal with trade-offs. But on that note, as we look to wrap this interview up, this is the question I like to ask in these interviews as I wrap up, right? Assuming, Lord willing, that we have different kinds of viewers on the channel, and we have the people with different needs, what is the final word that you would give to each of two groups? So the first group being any Roman Catholics may be listening and they may be considering joining a Protestant tradition, and then the second group being any Protestants that may be listening and they're actually struggling with anxiety about this stuff, with ecclesial anxiety, and they're feeling tempted to make the jump over to Rome. What would you say to each of these groups as a final word?
Gain perspective. Look at Scripture. Look at those claims against what's going on in Scripture, right? So where we said, Jesus expected people to understand Scripture without an infallible magisterium. Trust in Christ alone. Don't pretend Don't pretend Pope Francis doesn't exist. Don't retreat to New King James onlyism or other stuff. Things like don't as Dr. White mentioned, don't trade certainty. Don't trade truth to gain certainty. And at the end of the day, you need to put your faith in God, not in a church, not in anything else, and read His Word. Become completely familiar with Scripture, and pray and trust Christ alone, apart from your good works. That's really, at the end of the day, all what we need to do.
Yeah.
And then, and also, don't be online arguing all the time like me. Uh, uh, Go to your soup kitchen. Go to help your deacons. Help your neighbor. Um, Make your faith active, and that'll be helpful for you too.
Yeah, and I want, if I can add to that as well. I think you're completely right. Unfortunately, so many of these arguments and the debate sphere online, is filled with people on both sides that are like, they live, breathe, and eat this stuff, and they want to debate Protestantism versus Roman Catholicism versus Eastern Orthodoxy versus, and they're not even plugged into their local church. And it's like, how can we expect to find any degree of peace or
Yeah,
answers, or
when you
if we're
wake
not
up
living
in
out
the
our faith?
morning, even if
Yeah,
you're in a not a perfect church or whatever, like, help your local pastor, help, get involved, uh, teach the kids in Sunday school, visit the elderly, or as much as you can. I mean, obviously, in different phases of life, we have different things we need to do. Um, there's plenty of things to do, even parachurch stuff. If you made a list of everything you can do, right? Like, get involved in evangelism. Uh, there's a severe lack of evangelism in the church. Not just street evangelism. Don't be afraid of street evangelism, but just talking to your neighbor. It's very hard to talk to neighbors. I fall under that condemnation as well. Uh, that was, if I have to say, the biggest need of the church uh, is lack of willingness to do evangelism, like actual evangelism. Talk to that would, I would say, would be the biggest need of the church.
and I think that's a good note even for us to end on, because that calls back to some of the stuff we've been saying throughout, which is, in order to be able to cut through some of this hyper skeptical like noise, you kind of need to be able to rely on reality. And how can you rely on reality if you're not out there actively loving your neighbor, actively serving in your local church, if you don't have much reality to to appeal to, it's kind of hard to do that. Um,
Yeah.
and so with that, brother, thank you so much for
All right.
coming
Thank
on.
you very much, man. It was really, Javier. It was really great talking to you.
Yeah. Is there anything else that you want to plug here at the end as we come to a close? Do you have
Well,
any content you're
my
planning or
channel is
anything you want
not
to?
active, but there should be some good Catholic resources there. We didn't really talk about the paranormal stuff that much. I have some good resources on UFOs, and I did some interesting work on. I had a really interesting interview on Fatima. I had a great interview on Bigfoot.
Cool.
Um, I'm telling you, you need to watch that Bigfoot interview. That was amazing. It was not me. It was, my guest was phenomenal.
Cool.
So
All right.
and just for like a fun, like, you don't want to have anything to do with Catholicism. You just want to. That was one of my biggest disappointments on, like, studying the paranormal. Is like, I just want to unplug from doing Catholic stuff and just look up UFO stuff, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, these Marian apparitions have UFO overlap. Crap. Now I got to bring it back to Catholicism.
So you can be our Protestant Jimmy Aiken, dealing with the
Yeah.
supernatural and with all that. Same,
People are like, oh, you
same
look
like.
like him. And no, I just have a red beard, dude.
You're just missing the cowboy hat, But all right,
Yeah,
well,
if I ever
thank
debate
you.
Jimmy Aiken, I'm just going to wear a cowboy hat and be like,
And then they won't know who's who.
I'll
But
be like,
yeah, no.
I'll be, yeah, no one will know who's who.
But All right, brother. Well, thank you so much for coming on. Maybe we can do something like this again if you pick up.
Yeah, well, just I'm going to try to have a live stream soon. It's probably after you edit this or whatever, or before you edit this and put it up. But on the other Paul's channel, we're going to have a stream where we're going to be ranking empires throughout history.
Okay, cool.
Through a tier list. That should be fun.
That'll be cool.
I had to like update my knowledge of the Khmer Empire in Cambodia, of all things. Yeah, I mean, just pick a topic and or if something comes up online or current events wise or something, especially things in my wheelhouse.
Might do something supernatural or something like that. Kind of cool.
Yeah, maybe do a discussion on the paranormal. That might be a good one.
So, all right, brother. Well, once again, thank you for coming on. And
all right, God bless.